NATO was never just about tanks. It was about risk, about whether investors would dare to rebuild factories in cities still smelling of smoke, about whether currencies would stabilize or spiral back into collapse, about whether Western Europe would drift into extremism under the weight of hunger, unemployment, and fear. And here's what most people miss. Before NATO was a military alliance, it was an economic guarantee. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and geopolitics collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. When people hear NATO, they think of Article 5, collective defense, troops at borders, Cold War map split between East and West. They imagine missiles, war rooms, generals studying lines across Europe. But by April 1949, when the North Atlantic Treaty was signed, Europe's most urgent threat wasn't a Soviet tank crossing the Rhine. It was economic collapse. World War II had left Western Europe physically shattered and financially fragile. Cities were rubble, factories silent, railways twisted metal, food scarce, currencies unstable, political movements radicalizing, and the memory of the Great Depression wasn't theory. It was lived trauma. In the 1930s, financial collapse had paved the way for extremism. Mass unemployment fueled resentment. Protectionism fractured global trade. Economic breakdown spiraled into global war. Policymakers in Washington, London, and Paris didn't have to imagine instability. They had just survived it. By 1947, the United States faced a cold calculation. Western Europe was too weak to recover alone, but too important to lose. Communist parties were rising in France and Italy. The Soviet Union was tightening its grip over Eastern Europe. Without economic stability, political alignment was uncertain. So in June 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced what became known as the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States transferred roughly $13 billion, over $150 billion in today's terms, in grants, loans, food, fuel, and machinery. But the Marshall Plan wasn't charity. It was strategy. Economic recovery would prevent radicalization. Political stability would limit Soviet expansion. And a prosperous Western Europe would become a reliable trading partner, anchored in a dollar-centered financial system. Money and power were moving together, but there was a problem no shipment of grain could solve. Investors did not build factories in places they believed might be invaded next year. Capital requires predictability. It requires assurance that borders will hold and governments will endure. Reconstruction without security is speculation. And in 1948, Europe still looked like a gamble. Then came the Berlin blockade. When the Soviet Union cut off land access to West Berlin, it wasn't just a geopolitical maneuver. It was a reminder that Europe's future was still contested. The United States responded with the Berlin airlift, supplying the city by air for nearly a year. A logistical triumph. But airlifts are not economic policy. They prove something critical. Economic recovery could be undone overnight by strategic uncertainty. This is an environment in which North Atlantic Treaty Organization emerged. On April 4th, 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty. Article 5 declared that an attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. On paper, it was a military commitment. In reality, it was something deeper. It reduced perceived risk. And in economics, perceived risk determines everything. Security lowers uncertainty. Lower uncertainty attracts capital. Capital rebuilds industry. Industry reinforces political stability. NATO did not rebuild Europe directly. It made rebuilding investable. In the early 1950s, growth accelerated. Industrial output surged. Trade expanded. Living standards rose. In West Germany, this transformation became known as the economic miracle. But miracles rarely happen in a vacuum. They happen inside systems. The United States provided money through the Marshall Plan. It provided security through NATO. That security umbrella allowed European governments to prioritize reconstruction over rearmament. Instead of rebuilding massive standing armies, they rebuilt factories, infrastructure, social safety nets. But this was not charity from Washington. It was structural investment. By tying Europe's security to American power, The United States entrenched the dollar at the center of global trade. Under the Bretton Woods system, currencies were pegged to the dollar and the dollar to gold. That system depended on trust. Trust that the Western Bloc would remain stable, aligned, secure. NATO reinforced that trust. A secure Europe was more likely to trade in dollars, more likely to integrate under American influence, more likely to recycle capital through U.S. financial markets. Stability abroad reinforced dollar dominance at home. At the same time, NATO gave the United States forward military positioning across the Atlantic, bases in Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, extending American strategic reach. Defending Europe from within Europe is cheaper than projecting power from thousands of miles away. The alliance converted military strength into geopolitical leverage, and leverage into economic influence. Nothing stabilizes a currency quite like a global security footprint. As Western Europe rebuilt, it became not just a political ally, but a vast export market. American machinery, goods, and capital flowed outward. European growth created solvent consumers. The Marshall Plan didn't simply transfer money. It created customers, prosperous allies by more than impoverished ones. This is where the story becomes more nuanced than the standard Cold War narrative. NATO was not only about containing Soviet tanks. It was about preventing economic instability from creating political openings. It lowered the risk premium on democracy in Western Europe. And in doing so, it positioned the United States at the center of a new economic order. Because alliances built on economic stabilization behave differently than alliances built only for war. They shape trade flows, influence fiscal decisions, alter investment patterns, determine who feels secure enough to take risks. Behind closed doors, policymakers understood. Markets and military commitments are intertwined. A defense guarantee reassures bond markets. A stable currency encourages cross-border trade. A predictable geopolitical environment reduces capital flight. Security became an economic asset. By the mid-1950s, the Western Bloc had not only stabilized, it began integrating. Institutions like the European Coal and Steel Community laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the European Union. Economic cooperation reduced the likelihood of inter-European conflict. NATO reduced the likelihood of external aggression. Together, they created a reinforcing loop. But loops create dependencies. As Europe relied on the American security umbrella, defense burdens became uneven. As capital flowed inside a secure zone, growth became tied to political alignment. And as the Cold War deepened, NATO's military dimension expanded, but its economic foundation remained essential. To understand NATO only as a defense pact is to miss half the architecture. It was a system designed to lock in stability, align incentives, protect a specific economic order. It lowered the cost of capital. And when you lower the cost of capital, you change history. It encouraged integration under a U.S.-led framework. It reassured markets that the fragmentation of the 1930s would not return. But systems built for stability do more than deter enemies. They shape behavior. And once economic confidence becomes intertwined with military commitments, disentangling them becomes complicated. Because at that point, North Atlantic Treaty Organization isn't just about defense. It becomes about the credibility of the entire Western financial system. And that's where the deeper story begins. Once NATO was in place, the Western alliance didn't just coordinate troops. It coordinated expectations. And expectations are the quiet engine of markets. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States produced nearly half of global industrial output. The dollar, anchored to gold under the Bretton Woods system, became the backbone of international trade. Western Europe, protected by NATO, rebuilt and integrated. The pieces fit. A secure economic zone emerged. Trade expanded, cross-border investment increased, supply chains deepened. The dollar's dominance wasn't forced at gunpoint. It was sustained by trust in a system that appeared cohesive and durable. But cohesion comes with trade-offs. By the late 1960s, global security commitments strained the American balance sheet. The Vietnam War, domestic spending, rising international dollar liabilities. Pressure mounted on U.S. gold reserves. In 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar was no longer convertible to gold. The monetary order shifted. Currencies floated. Markets adjusted. But NATO did not unravel. The security framework remained intact. And that mattered. Even as monetary foundations changed, the transatlantic alliance continued signaling alignment and markets price signals. A bond market reacts not just to debt, but to political stability. A currency reflects not just trade balances, but confidence. By projecting unity, NATO reinforced the perception that the Western system was durable, even without gold backing. Meanwhile, European integration accelerated. The European Economic Community evolved into the European Union. Eventually, the euro was introduced. None of this happened in isolation. Economic integration is easier under a shared security umbrella. Security reduces internal suspicion. Reduced suspicion lowers transaction costs. That's the economic architecture of NATO at work. During the Cold War, the logic was obvious. The Soviet Union existed. The threat was clear. But in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Many assumed NATO would fade. Instead, it expanded. Former Warsaw Pact countries joined. The alliance moved eastward. Why? Because by then, NATO was no longer just a response to a threat. It was embedded in the operating system of the Western financial order. Membership signaled political alignment, regulatory predictability, lower geopolitical risk. Investors noticed. Countries inside the alliance often benefited from lower perceived risk premiums. Borrowing costs reflected not only fiscal discipline, but strategic positioning. Security became an economic credential. This doesn't mean NATO controls markets. It means markets incorporate security frameworks into risk assessments. Lower perceived risk, lower borrowing costs, higher investment, deeper integration. Nothing reduces a country's risk premium like being seen as part of a powerful, stable club. But stability creates asymmetry. The United States shouldered a disproportionate share of defense spending. European nations allocated more toward welfare and economic development. Tensions surface periodically, but friction inside a stable framework is different from fragmentation. And fragmentation is what markets fear. In the 21st century, the economic dimension has become impossible to ignore. Energy supply chains, semiconductors, shipping lanes, cyber infrastructure. These are not purely military issues. They are economic arteries. When tensions rise along NATO's eastern flank, markets react. Energy prices move. Defense stocks surge. Government budgets shift. Inflation ripples outward. The line between military alliance and economic architecture blurs. Consider energy. For decades, Western Europe relied heavily on Russian natural gas. When that dependency collided with geopolitical tension, prices surged. Governments scrambled to diversify supply. Defense policy and energy policy fused. Households felt the impact, not through troop deployments, but through utility bills. Money and power intersect quietly. An alliance that stabilizes borders also stabilizes trade routes. An alliance that deters aggression shapes infrastructure investment. When NATO expanded eastward, it didn't just move a defensive line. It reshaped economic expectations. This doesn't make NATO benevolent or malevolent. It makes it structural, and structures endure. The central insight isn't that NATO secretly controls the global economy. It's that economic systems depend on predictable security frameworks. The post-war Western financial order, from Bretton Woods to today, has rested on an assumption of transatlantic stability. Remove that assumption, and markets would reprice risk, not in speeches, in bond yields, exchange rates, capital flows, higher borrowing costs, lower growth expectations, greater volatility. Security commitments influence spreadsheets, and that's why the present matters. In an era of rising debt, demographic pressure, and geopolitical competition, alliances face strain. Defense budgets increase. Public finances tighten. Political movements question commitments. Markets watch. The temptation is to frame debates ideologically. But beneath ideology lies economics. Alliances shape the environment in which capital moves. History offers a pattern. After World War I, financial chaos protectionism fractured Europe. After World War II, coordinated security and reconstruction created stability. NATO emerged from that lesson. Security is not merely military. It is economic. And here is the final reflection. Alliances are not just about who you defend. They are about what economic order you sustain. NATO was born from fear of economic collapse as much as invasion. It bound together markets and militaries, dollars and defense commitments, risk and reassurance. It reduced uncertainty long enough for a new economic system to take root. Understanding that doesn't tell you what position to take in modern debates. It tells you what's at stake beneath them. When people argue about NATO in 2026, they debate budgets, borders, and strategy. But they are also debating the architecture underpinning transatlantic markets. History doesn't repeat, but incentives remain constant. Security lowers risk. Lower risk attracts capital. Capital builds systems. Systems create dependencies. And once money and power intertwine, separating them is rarely simple.